The evening sparkled with celebration. Balloons hovered near the vaulted ceiling of the Watsons' suburban home, shimmering gold and black, spelling out 60. Soft jazz drifted through the air, mingling with the hum of conversation and the occasional clink of champagne glasses. Friends, family, and colleagues surrounded Charles Watson, an esteemed cardiologist, as he basked in the glow of his surprise 60th birthday party. His wife, Eleanor, had orchestrated the event with precision. She was radiant in an emerald green dress that hugged her frame, her diamond earrings catching the light each time she turned her head to greet a guest. At her side, Charles seemed every bit the devoted husband and father, stoic, dignified, yet visibly moved by the outpouring of affection. But Eleanor's smile, dazzling as it appeared, concealed a storm beneath its surface. For weeks, whispers had gnawed at her peace. The hushed tones of her husband's phone calls, the sudden late nights at the hospital, and most damningly, the lipstick-smudged collar she'd discovered folded hastily in the laundry, all pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. The answer had come unexpectedly in the form of her own intuition and a bit of well-placed cunning. A chance visit to the hospital under the guise of bringing Charles lunch had revealed more than she'd bargained for. The fleeting but unmistakable brush of his hand against the lower back of her, young, blonde, and impossibly flirtatious. Eleanor had kept her composure then, but her decision had been made. Tonight would be the night. As the evening wore on, Eleanor took a center stage with a wineglass in hand. She smiled graciously, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice smooth as velvet, "thank you all for joining us to celebrate Charles's milestone. 60 years of life, 40 years of medicine, and 30 years of marriage, too." She paused, the barest flicker of emotion betraying her. "To me?" A ripple of polite laughter passed through the crowd. Charles beamed at her, his glass raised. "And what a life it's been," Eleanor continued, her tone warming. "Charles has always been dedicated, fiercely so, to his career, to his patients, and, I believed, to his family." Something in her voice sharpened, an edge so faint it could have been missed by anyone not paying close attention. But Charles heard it. His smile faltered. "And tonight," Eleanor said, lifting her glass, "I want to toast, not just to the man who has been my husband, but also to the woman who's been so instrumental in making him feel young again." The room stilled. All eyes turned to Eleanor, then darted toward Charles, who now stood rigid, his complexion paling. "You know who you are," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a bite of cold steel. She looked directly at a woman in the corner of the room, Amber, a nurse from Charles's practice. Amber's face flushed crimson, her attempt to shrink into the shadows only drawing more attention. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Charles took an involuntary step forward. "Eleanor," he began, his voice cracking, "this isn't the time." "Oh, but it is the time, darling," Eleanor interrupted, her smile thin and cutting. "After all, what better way to celebrate your youthful vigor than by acknowledging the woman half your age who's helped you find it?" The silence was deafening. Eleanor tilted her head toward Amber. "Perhaps you'd like to say a few words," Amber stammered, her glass trembling in her hand. I don't know what you're talking about." Charles moved swiftly, his voice low but urgent. "Eleanor, stop this. Now." Eleanor turned to him, her composure unshaken. "Why? Embarrassed? Or are you simply afraid that everyone here will see you for what you truly are?" The room erupted in murmurs, the guests torn between disbelief and voyeuristic fascination. Eleanor downed her wine in one defiant gulp, placed the glass on the table, and walked away, her head held high. Charles was left standing, exposed under the garish light of his own betrayal. Amber slipped out quietly, leaving the guests to piece together the fragments of a scandal that would ripple through their community for months to come. In the kitchen, Eleanor leaned against the counter, her breath steadying. The celebration had ended in a way no one had anticipated, but for her, it had been the perfect finale. The aftermath of Eleanor's revelation at the party spread like wildfire through their close-knit social circle. By the time the first rays of morning light filtered through the curtains of the Watson home, the phone calls and text messages had already started. Some were sympathetic, others awkwardly neutral, and a few were outright prying. Eleanor ignored them all, sitting at the dining table with a steaming cup of coffee and a stoic expression. Charles, meanwhile, had spent the night in the guest room, a self-imposed exile after Eleanor's blistering refusal to hear his excuses. The house was unnaturally quiet, except for the ticking of the antique clock in the hall. By noon, the tension between them boiled over. Charles appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, his face drawn and haggard. "We need to talk," he said. Eleanor didn't look up. "About what? The woman you've been screwing behind my back? Or how you managed to humiliate me in front of everyone we know?" His jaw tightened. "It wasn't like that, Eleanor. Save it," she cut in, her voice icy. "Whatever justification you think you have, I don't want to hear it." "You don't understand," he said, stepping closer. "Amber, this wasn't serious. It was a mistake, a lapse in judgment." Eleanor finally looked up, her eyes blazing. "A lapse in judgment? Is that what you call months of sneaking around, lying to my face, and dragging some girl half your age into our lives?" Charles sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I know I screwed up. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Eleanor let out a bitter laugh. "Make it right? Do you even know what that means? You've destroyed the trust we built over 3 decades, Charles. Trust isn't something you can patch up with apologies and promises." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt thick and suffocating. Finally, Eleanor rose from her chair, her posture rigid. "You know what the worst part is?" she said, her voice softer, but no less cutting. "I wasn't even surprised. I saw the signs, and I chose to ignore them. I believed in you, in us, even when my gut told me something was wrong." Charles lowered his gaze, guilt and shame etched across his face. "I want you out of this house," Eleanor continued. "Take whatever you need, but I can't have you here right now." He looked up, startled. "Eleanor, don't do this. We can fix this." "No," she interrupted firmly. "You broke this, and right now, I don't know if it can be fixed." Charles opened his mouth to protest, but stopped himself. He nodded reluctantly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The days that followed were a blur for Eleanor. She poured herself into her work at the local nonprofit she'd helped build, using the chaos of daily operations to drown out the echo of her crumbling marriage. But the quiet moments were the hardest, when the house felt too empty, too still, and the weight of betrayal settled like a stone in her chest. Charles, true to his word, moved into a small apartment near the hospital. Rumors swirled among their friends and colleagues, each story more dramatic than the last. Eleanor refused to engage, letting the gossip play itself out while she focused on rebuilding her life. Amber, the nurse at the center of it all, resigned from her position at the hospital a week after the party. Some said it was to avoid the scandal. Others whispered that she had been pressured by higher-ups. Eleanor didn't care. Amber was a symptom, not the disease. 3 months later, Eleanor sat in her lawyer's office, reviewing the preliminary terms of the divorce. It was a surreal moment, the finality of it all sinking in. Yet, amidst the sadness, there was a sense of liberation, a chance to start anew. Charles had tried reaching out several times, sending flowers, letters, and even showing up unannounced one evening. But Eleanor had remained steadfast. She wasn't ready to forgive, and perhaps she never would be. As she left the lawyer's office that day, the crisp autumn air filled her lungs, and for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of peace. The chapter with Charles was closing, but Eleanor knew her story was far from over. She had been betrayed, but she wasn't broken, and as she walked down the bustling city street, her head held high, she realized she wasn't walking away from her life. She was stepping into a new one. The months following the divorce brought Eleanor a strange mix of freedom and loneliness. She sold the house, unable to bear the memories embedded in its walls, and moved into a modern townhouse closer to the city. The space was smaller but felt refreshingly hers, a blank slate unmarred by Charles's shadow. Eleanor's days were full, but her nights often brought an ache she couldn't ignore. The silence was deafening at times, and the absence of companionship, even tainted as it had been, left a void she struggled to fill. But Eleanor was determined to heal, piece by piece, no matter how long it took. One evening, she attended a charity gala hosted by her nonprofit. Dressed in a sleek black gown, Eleanor moved gracefully through the room, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with donors and community leaders. She had always been good at wearing a mask in public, but tonight, something felt different. "Eleanor Watson," a voice said behind her, warm and steady. She turned to see a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a kind smile. He extended his hand. "I'm Dr. Victor Harrington. I've heard a lot about the incredible work you've done with the foundation." Eleanor smiled politely. "Thank you, Dr. Harrington. And you are?" "A neurologist," he replied. "Recently relocated here from Chicago. A friend of mine insisted I attend tonight's event, and I'm glad I did." Eleanor arched an eyebrow, intrigued but guarded. "And why is that?" Victor chuckled softly. "Because I've just met the most remarkable woman in the room." Eleanor felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. She laughed lightly, deflecting the compliment. "You must be a smooth talker, Dr. Harrington." "Not usually," he admitted, "but tonight I couldn't resist." The conversation flowed effortlessly from there. Victor spoke about his work, his passion for helping underserved communities, and his new life in the city. Eleanor found herself opening up in a way she hadn't expected, sharing her journey of rebuilding after her marriage's implosion. "I admire your strength," Victor said, his tone sincere. "It takes courage to start over." Eleanor smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her. "It hasn't been easy, but I'm learning that sometimes letting go is the only way to move forward." In the weeks that followed, Eleanor and Victor crossed paths more frequently, first at community events, and later over coffee and quiet dinners. Their connection was slow and unhurried, a stark contrast to the whirlwind romance she had once shared with Charles. Victor was attentive and honest, his interest in Eleanor unwavering, but never overwhelming. He respected her boundaries, giving her space to heal, while gently encouraging her to embrace new possibilities. For Eleanor, it was a revelation. She had thought her heart too battered to feel anything again. Yet here was a man who saw her not as a scorned woman, but as someone vibrant, capable, and worthy of love. One evening, they walked through a park as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city. Eleanor hesitated, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. "I never thought I'd find myself here," she said softly. Victor glanced at her, his expression curious. Where's that? Feeling like there's a future worth looking forward to, she admitted. Victor stopped, turning to face her. Eleanor, the past doesn't define you. It's part of your story, yes, but it doesn't have to be the whole book. She smiled, his words resonating deeply. For the first time, she felt a sense of closure, not just with Charles, but with the version of herself who had clung so tightly to a broken marriage out of fear of the unknown. Victor took her hand, his touch steady and warm. Whatever comes next, Eleanor, you're not alone. In the months and years that followed, Eleanor's life blossomed in ways she hadn't imagined. Her work with the nonprofit expanded, helping countless families in need. Her friendships deepened, free from the strain of keeping up appearances. And with Victor, she discovered a partnership built on trust, mutual respect, and genuine affection. Eleanor Watson's journey wasn't perfect, nor was it without pain. But as she stood in her garden one crisp morning, watching the first blooms of spring unfurl, she realized something profound. She hadn't just survived the betrayal, she had thrived in its aftermath. Her story, once defined by heartbreak, was now a testament to resilience and the enduring possibility of new beginnings. Eleanor had thought the chapter with Charles was closed, but life, as it often does, had other plans. It was a drizzly Thursday evening when the past came knocking, literally. Eleanor was finishing a glass of wine and reading a novel when the sharp rap on her townhouse door broke the tranquility. She wasn't expecting anyone, least of all the man standing on her doorstep. "Charles," she said, her voice flat with surprise and irritation. "What are you doing here?" Charles looked older, wearier, as though the months since their separation had aged him more than the years before. He shifted awkwardly, clutching a leather folder in his hands. "Eleanor," he began, his tone almost pleading, "I need to talk to you. Please." She hesitated, instinctively gripping the edge of the door. Part of her wanted to slam it in his face, but another part, the one that still held a fragment of compassion, relented. "5 minutes," she said, stepping aside. Charles entered cautiously, his eyes scanning the room as though it might reveal the life Eleanor had built without him. She motioned for him to sit, but he declined, standing near the mantel, as if afraid to settle. "I've been thinking," he began, his words halting. "About everything. About us. About what I did to you." Eleanor folded her arms, her expression unyielding. "And I was wrong," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I know that doesn't change anything, but I need you to hear it. I hurt you in ways I can never undo, and I will regret it for the rest of my life." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "What is this, Charles? An apology tour, closure for your conscience?" "No," he said quickly. "This isn't about me. It's about you. You deserved better than what I gave you, and I need you to know. I see that now." For a moment, the air between them hung heavy with unspoken words. Eleanor wanted to scream at him, to tell him that his belated remorse meant nothing, but instead she stayed silent, letting the weight of his confession settle. "And there's something else," Charles added, his voice quieter now. "Something you should know." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "What?" Charles placed the leather folder on the coffee table and slid it toward her. She stared at it for a moment before cautiously picking it up and flipping it open. Inside were documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. As she skimmed through them, her breath caught. "These are hospital records," she said, frowning. "Yes," Charles confirmed. "From the cardiology department. I've been investigating for months, since the divorce. There's been a pattern of irregularities. cases that were mishandled, patients put at risk. Eleanor looked up sharply. Why are you telling me this? Because Amber was at the center of it, Charles admitted, his voice laden with guilt. She wasn't just my mistake. She was using me, Eleanor, manipulating me to cover her tracks, and I was too blind, too selfish, to see it. Eleanor's mind reeled as she processed his words. You're saying she endangered patients, committed malpractice? Charles nodded grimly. Yes, and I helped her by signing off on things I shouldn't have. I didn't realize it at the time, but now that I've connected the dots, I can't stay silent. Eleanor's hands trembled as she closed the folder. And what do you expect me to do with this? I don't know, Charles admitted, but I trust you to do the right thing. You always have. The next morning, Eleanor found herself staring at the folder over her kitchen counter. She had no obligation to involve herself, yet the idea of walking away from the truth felt impossible. She wasn't the same woman who had silently endured betrayal. She had rebuilt her life on honesty, courage, and a refusal to let others define her. By the afternoon, she had reached out to a lawyer and a journalist she trusted, laying the groundwork for a proper investigation. The documents were handed over to the authorities, and soon the scandal engulfed the hospital, sending shockwaves through the medical community. Amber's name was splashed across headlines, and Charles wasn't spared either. While his role was peripheral, his complicity in enabling her actions cost him his position and his reputation. Months later, as Eleanor walked through the bustling halls of her nonprofit, she felt a sense of closure, not for her marriage, but for the lingering shadows of its aftermath. Charles had sought her forgiveness, but she had given him something else instead: accountability. Victor met her at the entrance as she prepared to leave for the evening. Big day? He asked, his hand lightly brushing hers. She smiled, leaning into his warmth. Always. As they stepped out into the cool evening air, Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction. She had confronted her past, not with anger, but with strength and clarity. Her story wasn't just one of betrayal or rebuilding. It was one of justice, growth, and, above all, resilience. Eleanor Watson had reclaimed her life, and no shadow of her past could ever diminish that. Eleanor had always believed in the power of closure, not the neat, tidy kind wrapped in platitudes, but the hard-earned kind that came from facing one's demons and standing tall afterward. Yet even as her life found a new rhythm, there was one piece of unfinished business that lingered in the back of her mind like an unwelcome guest: Charles. The scandal surrounding the hospital had finally settled, though the fallout had been immense. Amber was stripped of her license, facing both legal and financial ruin. Charles had cooperated with authorities, avoiding criminal charges, but losing his position and credibility in the process. Eleanor had hoped that would be the end of their entanglement, but a small handwritten note from him arrived one morning, forcing her to confront the final chapter. The note was brief. Eleanor, I don't deserve your time, but I need to see you one last time. If you can, meet me at the garden. Charles. She knew exactly where he meant. The garden was a small, tucked-away spot at the edge of the park where they used to walk in their younger days, a place of quiet reflection and shared dreams, dreams that felt like a lifetime ago. When Eleanor arrived, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the manicured hedges and blooming flowers. Charles was already there, sitting on a weathered bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. He looked smaller somehow, his frame less imposing, his once pristine suit slightly wrinkled. "You came," he said, rising awkwardly as she approached. "I did," Eleanor replied, her voice calm but guarded. "What is it, Charles?" He gestured for her to sit, and though hesitant, she obliged, leaving enough distance between them to make her boundaries clear. "I've lost everything," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "My career, my reputation, my sense of purpose, and I know I have no one to blame but myself." Eleanor crossed her arms. "If you're looking for pity, you won't find it here." Charles nodded, a faint, rueful smile crossing his lips. "I'm not. I just wanted to tell you, thank you, for everything, even for holding me accountable. You've always been stronger than me, Eleanor, and you were right to leave." She studied him, searching for any trace of manipulation, but found none. What she saw instead was a broken man, one who had finally come to terms with the consequences of his choices. "I don't hate you, Charles," she said softly. "I never did. But what you did, it broke something in me. Something I'll never fully get back." His eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I know. And if I could undo it, I would." Eleanor shook her head. "But you can't. And that's the truth we both have to live with." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the sounds of the park filling the space between them. Birds chirped in the distance, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead. "I'm leaving," Charles said finally. "Leaving?" "The city," he clarified. "I've been offered a position at a small clinic out of state. It's not much, but it's a chance to start over, to be of use again." Eleanor nodded, her heart surprisingly light. "Maybe that's what you need." Charles turned to her, his expression earnest. "I just wanted you to know that no matter where I go, I'll always carry the regret of what I did to us, and I'll always wish you the happiness I couldn't give you." Eleanor met his gaze, and for the first time in years, she felt no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet, solemn understanding. "Goodbye, Charles," she said, standing. "Goodbye, Eleanor," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As Eleanor walked away, she felt an unexpected sense of peace wash over her. She hadn't needed his apology to move on, but hearing it, seeing his vulnerability, had finally closed the door on the life they had shared. She returned to her townhouse, where Victor was waiting with a bottle of wine and a warm smile. They sat together on the couch, sharing stories and laughter as the evening unfolded. Eleanor realized something profound as she leaned into Victor's steady presence. Forgiveness wasn't about absolving the past. It was about freeing herself from its hold. Her journey had come full circle, and for the first time, she was truly at peace. Eleanor Watson had reclaimed her life, not just as a survivor, but as a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ashes, and she was ready for whatever the future held. Eleanor Watson was no stranger to starting over, but as the years unfolded, she realized her story wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation. Life with Victor blossomed into a partnership built on mutual respect and shared passions. He became an integral part of Eleanor's work at the nonprofit, offering his expertise to expand healthcare initiatives for underserved communities. Together, they created programs that provided medical care, education, and resources to families in need. Their love story was quieter than her first, but it was steady, grounding her in ways she had never thought possible. One afternoon, Eleanor found herself walking through the community center her nonprofit had built. Children's laughter echoed down the halls, and volunteers bustled between classrooms. She stopped at a wall near the entrance, where a plaque displayed the names of donors and contributors. Her gaze lingered on the bold letters at the top. The Eleanor Watson Foundation. It had been Victor's idea to rename the organization after her. At first, she resisted, uncomfortable with the spotlight. But he had convinced her, saying, "You've turned your pain into something that changes lives. People should know who made this possible." Now, as she traced her fingers over the engraved letters, she felt a swell of pride, not for the name, but for the work it represented. Despite her successes, Eleanor knew the scars of her past would never fully fade. Occasionally, reminders of her former life would surface. An old photograph tucked in a forgotten drawer, or a chance encounter with someone who knew her during the Charles years. One such moment occurred at a charity gala. Eleanor was mingling with guests when a familiar voice stopped her in her tracks. "Eleanor," the woman said, her tone hesitant, yet warm. She turned to see Patricia, one of the hospital board members who had attended Charles's ill-fated birthday party. Patricia had been kind to Eleanor in the aftermath of the scandal, but they had lost touch over time. "Patricia," Eleanor said with a genuine smile, "it's been ages." The two women caught up, exchanging updates about their lives. Eventually, the conversation turned to Charles. "Did you hear?" Patricia asked cautiously. "Hear what?" Eleanor replied, her curiosity piqued. "He's been doing remarkable work at that clinic out of state. He's taken on some of the toughest cases, patients no one else would touch. They're even talking about giving him an award for his contributions." Eleanor's first instinct was bitterness, a flicker of resentment at the thought of Charles finding redemption after the damage he had caused. But as she stood there, she realized she felt nothing. "Good for him," she said simply, and she meant it. Patricia seemed surprised, but nodded. "You're a bigger person than I'd be." Eleanor smiled faintly. "It's not about being big or small. It's about letting go." That night, Eleanor sat with Victor on their balcony, overlooking the city lights. A cool breeze rustled the curtains, and the scent of jasmine filled the air. "I ran into Patricia," she said, sipping her tea. "Oh?" Victor asked, looking up from his book. "She mentioned Charles. Apparently he's doing good work at that clinic." Victor tilted his head, studying her. "How do you feel about that?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I'm glad he's found a way to make amends, but it's not my burden to carry anymore." Victor reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You've come a long way, Eleanor." She smiled, leaning into him. "We both have." Years later, as Eleanor approached her 70th birthday, the foundation celebrated a milestone, the opening of a state-of-the-art community health center in her name. The event was attended by hundreds, colleagues, friends, and even strangers whose lives had been touched by her work. Eleanor stood at the podium, the weight of her journey pressing lightly against her heart. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes glistening with emotion. "This center isn't just a building," she began. "It's a symbol of what can be achieved when we refuse to let life's challenges define us, when we take our pain, our struggles, and turn them into something meaningful." The audience erupted in applause, but Eleanor wasn't done. "I want to thank everyone who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. And to those who doubted me, thank you too. You pushed me to prove that I am more than the sum of my mistakes." As the applause swelled again, Eleanor stepped back, letting the moment wash over her. In the twilight of her life, Eleanor Watson had become more than a survivor of betrayal. She was a builder of legacies, a woman who had turned heartbreak into hope, not just for herself, but for countless others. Her story wasn't one of bitterness or revenge. It was a testament to the human spirit's capacity for growth, resilience, and love. and as she watched the crowd celebrating her life's work, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Complete. Eleanor celebrated her 70th birthday surrounded by friends, family, and colleagues. It was a significant moment in her life, but deep down, she felt a sense of restlessness. She had always believed her journey was about transforming pain into strength. Yet now, with all her projects thriving and her legacy secure, a new question arose. What comes next? Victor, her steadfast partner and constant source of encouragement, had been gently nudging her toward focusing on herself. "You've spent so much of your life giving to others," he told her one evening. "Maybe now it's time to give back to yourself." The idea intrigued her. For decades, Eleanor's energy had been poured outward, first into healing after Charles's betrayal, then into creating something meaningful for her community. But what about the dreams she had set aside long ago?